Okay, in the interest of time, let's make a start. Thank you and welcome to everyone who's joined today. My name is Mike Smitherman. I look after sales and marketing over here at Metric Insights. Also have Marius Moscovici on with us again. Hi, Marius.
Hello again, Mike. Glad to do this again.
So So today, another session in this series of webinars that we've been doing today focused around AI governance in the BI space. So we're going to be touching on that, showing you slides and demos again. As usual, the usual housekeeping pieces. We are recording this session, so we'll be sending out a link to it afterwards, so you can share it with other folks on your team. Lines are muted, but feel free to enter questions in the chat window or the Q&A window. We'll come back to those at the end of the session. But with that, let's get going, and I'll hand it over to Marius.
Thank you, Mike. So, in this next episode of our masterclass, we really wanted to focus on sort of AI for BI and really cut through a lot of the hype that's out there today. I don't think I have to tell anyone on this call that there's so much hype out there. If I see one more demo where it's all like, see how easy it is to do this, and click click click, and I think it's just go crazy, right? Like it's just insane how much everybody overhypes this area. And so we want to really get to the bottom of like, what is it? What are the real challenges? And then and how do you really address the challenges that are absolutely 100% there from a governance perspective, and lay the groundwork for success in an environment where things are changing very rapidly and there are lots of choices. So let's first start by talking a little bit about the landscape, and we did a little bit of a discussion on this in the first episode of this masterclass where we talked about the different kinds of tools, but I think it's worth revisiting the ecosystem because it is highly fragmented, right? Everybody and their cousin has a AI solution in the space. So it's good to understand what's there, what are some of the advantages and trade-offs associated with these solutions. That way you're just cognizant. And I think I'm going to present this not from the perspective of like, hey, you need to pick one solution to work with, because the reality is that in many organizations, there's kind of a let a thousand flowers bloom type mentality, where different folks in different parts of the organization are trying different things, and rightfully so, to figure out what works for them. But more so, just so you have a general sense of, what is going to work, and then what are some of the, limitations there that are based on different solutions. So what are some of the options? Well, the most obvious ones for BI start with the BI vendors. So literally every BI vendor, almost every BI vendor has a in-dashboard solution. So, Microsoft has Copilot, Tableau has Pulse, right? You have all these things where you can ask a question, and then you can kind of follow an analysis and work with AI to try to answer things. In many cases, it changes what you shows you on the dashboard. In other cases, it just gives you information from the semantic model that's there for the dashboard, but it allows sort of a conversational analytics to be added to the dashboard experience. And these solutions, the big advantage of these solutions is it's just a matter of switching them on, and they're available in the dashboard. But largely, what we've seen and when talking to many of our customers, we've heard, that so far the quality of these solutions, is very, very highly tied to the quality of the semantic model underneath. So that's a one major consideration or limitation you need to be aware of. So if you have a semantic model that you're working with, or Tableau, I guess the data source, what they call it, right? That where there's maybe some measures are not clearly defined, maybe there's a little bit of ambiguity, maybe the schema is somewhat complex and how it's set up and how you should, how to navigate it. You can often get sort of inconsistent or incorrect results from the questions, right? Because the dashboard is specifically designed with somebody who has a lot of implicit understanding of what's there in the semantic model, beyond maybe what's documented in the model. If that's the case, then when you ask the LLM a question, it can't benefit from that knowledge knowledge that was in the developer's head, but was not instantiated into the semantic model, and therefore it can go in the wrong direction. So just be aware of that. The other big limitation for sort of in-dashboard type solutions is that it's not always obvious. In fact, it's almost never obvious for the end user what the scope of context is for what they can ask, right? You know, if you think about it, if you as a developer of the dashboard are aware of what's in the semantic model, but your business user has no idea. So they may very well ask a question that just has it doesn't is not covered in the model, right? And it requires some adjacency that's not there, and oftentimes that can generate frustration because obviously any kind of in-dashboard solution is limited to the scope that that dashboard covers in the semantic model. In Power BI, you can now do it at the app level, but then again, it covers only what's the semantic models are within that app. So it can be a very unsatisfying experience for your users, given that they're used to, just like the rest of us, they're using ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude or Google AI Answers, AI Overview. They're using that every day, and those things that they experience in their day-to-day consumer experiences don't have any of such limitations. They're not sort of sandboxed, and so kind of having that limitation when they ask a question at work can feel very frustrating and dissatisfying too. So be aware of that. Another solution is that some of the BI tool vendors is they provide kind of an auto dashboard solution that then kind of can span multiple semantic models. So Power BI has a home feature. There are other tools that have kind of these like little gateways where you can connect to all the different models that are there, multiple models, and ask questions. And these can provide more breadth, and they can provide routing across many different sort of spaces of different agents, which is great. So that addresses the constraint of like I ask a question and I don't need to know what scope. My scope is much broader, so I don't have to kind of have as much of an awareness of what scope of question I can ask. So that's great. But the limitation of this approach, and it's a significant one, is that there's a whole nother destination to go to, right? I'm consuming my dashboard in Power BI or in Tableau, wherever it is, and now I've got to go someplace completely different to ask questions. And having another destination can be a significant barrier to adoption, and it can also not be clear to use as well. How does this really tie to the numbers I'm seeing on the dashboard? Is it the same, or is it computed the same way? Is it something completely different? Right? It's a fundamental limitation of this kind of a solution that you just can't figure that out. Right? Another option that's very common now, it's becoming increasingly common, are in database solutions. So these are, Databricks has Genie, Snowflake has, Snowflake Intelligence. So you've got lots of different capabilities here where you can just with a few clicks create an agent and then use the interface that vendor provides to be able to ask questions of that agent and have a conversation with your data. So these have the advantages of being able to pretty quick to get started. The disadvantage is similar to the auto dashboard vendor solutions. It's just another destination. And in this case, it's even a bigger challenge in many cases because your business users are definitely not in Snowflake or Databricks in most of their days, right? They are working inside of their BI tools or in Excel or in other kind of visualization tools. So this is very disjoint from their current experience. Of course, there's ways to integrate that into some other custom app that you build that you can deploy somewhere else, etc. But by themselves, they're insufficient unless they're kind of layered into the overall workflow that your users have in order to get significant adoption for what you're creating. And then finally, definitely worth mentioning that there are AI native solutions. In many ways, these came first before many of the large vendors created, like, companies like Wisdom, AI, Wise, a variety of companies that have sprung up that are doing just analytics that didn't have a visualization tool of any kind, and are building just completely talk to your data or conversation analytics systems from scratch. These sometimes are a little bit more have a little more flexibility because they're not constrained by the underlying tool that you're using. But yet again, this is a problem because it requires another tool and this suffers from the disadvantage of having it's not even unlike the in dashboard solutions or the out of dashboard sort of solutions that share the dashboard semantic model, like Fabric data agents, for example. The AI native solutions are using a completely different semantic model. So now you've got to sort of deal with semantic models separately, knowledge separately. So there's a there's a challenge there as far as from an overall governance and management perspective that your metadata is kind of has to live somewhere else as well. So that's kind of a little bit of a 30,000-foot view, and you want to keep that in mind as you're looking for the solution or solutions that are right for you. And again, you may find that there are multiple things that you see in your ecosystem because oftentimes most organizations have different groups that are chasing some of these goals simultaneously, and they may choose to use different technology. One person may hand code something using Vertex, and someone else may use something that's out of the box from some other tool for a different group. Okay, so what's the fundamental problem, right? Well, at a high level, right? If you look at the most enterprises, is that you have data and BI governance generally at least thought out to some extent, right? You probably have a data catalog in your environment. You've thought about how to handle PI data. You may or may not be far along in that journey. There may be issues. We've talked about some of that in other sessions in our masterclass. But you have something, right? In the BI space, again, you have some kind of a governance strategy that hopefully is coherent. You've built your own custom portal. You've used some other solution. You've figured out how security should work, how discoverability should work, permissioning, how that works with your data catalog. You've probably done some work there, and you're at some stage of maturity, but you're kind of working on that. But essentially, pretty much 100% of organizations, or certainly 90% plus today, lack a coherent AI strategy that is integrated with this. So sure, certainly they have maybe a generic AI strategy, like, hey, we don't want to send our confidential information to some random AI in the cloud, right? That there's probably governance around like which AI do you use, what kind of information can you share with them, which tools can you use to integrate with them. That exists in most, if not all, organizations. But what's lacking is a coherent vision of how the AI, BI, and data governance strategies and fit together, interlock to form a coherent whole. And this is fundamentally very important because people are going to be increasingly consuming their content across all three of these layers. So why? So let me just sort of like dig a little deeper here and say, like, why is it that I'm saying this AI for BI type strategy is important? Why is it that without that governance, you have a problem, right? So let's look at that. First of all, because you're going to have a whole bunch of different solutions, you want to be able to understand very clearly like who's using each of your AI for BI solutions, right? If you can't answer that question, you can't even begin to claim to have governance. And if everybody is doing each group is doing their own AI for BI solution using a different technology without any kind of coherent observability and monitoring, and usage tracking, essentially, right? If there's no usage tracking that's consistent across those, you're not going to be able to know that answer because maybe somebody implemented really good logging around this and can answer that question. Maybe someone at some other group just wrote something from scratch and did not do that, or so like not having consistency in usage is obviously a table stakes analysis that you need to be able to tell, right? There's a fundamental issue with trust. So from a consumption layer, if I'm a user and I want to use something, because it's so easy for anyone to go into, let's say, Fabric and create a data agent, or Genie and create some kind of agent, or turn on for Power BI dashboard, the Copilot. I want, for end user, it creates this real confusion where I don't know if the AI that having a conversation with has been sort of vetted and certified, and somebody ran evaluations against it and made sure that it's fit for purpose and is highly reliable? Or is it something that, some developer created as a POC and just threw out there, and it sort of works some of the time, but not very often, and but they didn't really take it down because hardly anyone ever takes anything down. So be able to distinguish between those two, knowing what I can trust, and therefore engaging with it with appropriate level of sort of scrutiny, and using it for the right purpose is very important. But without any kind of governance framework in place, you just can't do it. Another issue is what I mentioned before, is that any kind of governed solution for AI for BI must have a coherent integration with existing BI solutions, right? You're not, there's this like completely false narrative that people have been pushing that, well, BI is completely going away. AI is going to replace it. And who knows, maybe that's going to be true 5, 10 years from now. But certainly in the near term, with current AI capabilities, the fact that hallucinations are not solved, the fact that, there are all these constraints around like um, putting guardrails and solving second order type questions effectively and things like that, it is not going to be the case that you're going to retire all your dashboards and with your shiny new talk to your data initiative. You're not going to do that. And in fact, if we look back at the historically, even when things were highly effective, like Tableau and Power BI came out with amazing visualizations, they were far superior to what you could do in Excel. People are still using Excel, right? Because it has its own set of advantages. So I think the rational, sort of sober, clear-eyed view here is to say AI solutions are going to sit side by side with BI solutions for the foreseeable future. There are different places where those two are going to be appropriate. If I want to do a deep dive analysis and have a kind of a follow-on conversation, that AI solution is probably the right one. If I just want to look quickly and understand how my numbers are performing, a dashboard's the right answer, right? And so you want to have both, and you want to have them working together. And so integration is an important part of governance. If you ignore that, you're doing so at your own peril. You're not going to be successful. And then finally, and this is coming up more and more in every organization, that the free ride era of AI for BI is coming to an end. The idea of like, hey, we got to figure out what we're doing with AI for BI. Here's some money, go try some stuff, right? The spaghetti against the wall approach. That's kind of starting to the patience for that from management is kind of decreasing. They've gone, okay, we did that for a few months. Now we really need to start figuring out, where's ROI coming in? We've invested in like 10, 15, 20 things, or try 3 or 4 or 5 things or whatever. Like, which of these things is actually generating ROI? And then let's lean into those, and those that are not, let's shut them down because, we don't need to pay licensing for things that we're not using. We don't need to have, spend time on supporting stuff that doesn't work. So being able to measure ROI is a key part of governance. And if you don't have that in your strategy, then you're not going to be able to come back to your management and justify why something that you invested in should get more investment, or identify the things that are being underinvested that need to go away, right? So that's critical. So given that investment in governance is critical, what's the framework? How do we solve for this, right? That's I think why you came to the masterclass. We want to give you some practical guidelines. So I want to talk about that sort of for the remainder of this webinar. So first things first is that we need to have a domain-driven architecture approach. So what I mean by that is there isn't going to be a generally speaking, because you have different tools, different groups. You have to have governance with the idea in mind that it's going to be a distributed process. It's going to be at best a hub and spoke kind of model, where some of this work is going to happen in different groups, and potentially it is going to happen with different tools. And simply both because organizationally different people are going to have to work on this and are going to be trying to solve for this, and also because the technological solutions that are suitable for a particular domain is going to be very different, right? The things that answers questions about customer support and what should be happening there, and it brings in data from that for an analytics, it may be very different from the thing that you use on your information in finance, or your information in manufacturing, etc. So thinking about it from a domain persona-driven approach approach is very important, right? Second thing is that you want to make sure you're integrated into your overall AI corporate strategy, right? So this kind of goes back to the point I was making earlier. You can't just have an overall AI strategy for tooling and we're going to use Glean and we're going to use something or whatever we're going to use, but and not have any idea of how that meshes with your BI strategy. Because all that's going to mean is that people are going to come into your corporate AI gateway. They're going to ask a question that has something to do with the related business intelligence assets. They're not going to find those assets. They're not going to be able to ask questions. They're going to be dissatisfied and they're not going to come back and use it again. So having those groups working together and coming up with a coherent strategy, the AI and the BI teams is very important. And then, you have to, from the beginning, understand how you're going to build trust with good governance. Right? So these are general principles. And so I want to kind of drill down and give you more concrete examples. And the easiest way I could think of doing that is to sort of talk a little bit about sort of how we sort of solve for this space in metric insights as an example. And that will give you some framing. And I think what I'm going to show you is from a principles perspective, I think really applies to any technology that you use, whether you roll something your own, whether you use our technology, some other vendor's technology, doesn't really matter. But having a concrete example rather than just a whole bunch of general statements, I think is going to really help solidify the concepts that we're talking about. Right. So let's look at kind of metric insights and how we've thought through our domain driven architecture. So those of you that may not be aware of what we do, we're a BI portal. People come in and they consume their analytics in there. So all the different tools that they have, like Power BI, Tableau dashboards, things like that, are all there for them to consume and engage with, right? So we have a tool called Concierge that helps provide it provides an AI centric approach to engaging with their analytics, right? And so kind of it out of the box provides a bunch of things that connect to our API natively, right? Things like helping you search, find the right asset, ask questions about glossary terms, ask questions like, how do I add something to the portal? Maybe have help articles, things of that nature. So, right? So that's kind of part of our, just by way of background, that's kind of what we do. That's what through our API, our concierge, of course, can serve those kinds of questions. That's what you'd expect, right? Every vendor would have their chatbot provide answers about the things that are relevant or their agent answer questions about things that are relevant in their tool. But then beyond that, when I say kind of taking an AI for BI domain-driven architecture, right? The idea is that you can register metric insights any number of domains. So you might have a sales domain, a customer support domain, finance, etc. Now, for each of these domains, you can now plug into whatever service you have in the enterprise that can answer questions around that, data type services, any of the choices that we talked about before, any of those menu of like possibilities, as long as those things support MCP. MCP is something called Model Context Protocol. It is the standard for different agents to talk to each other, right? So this came out of Anthropic. It's been adopted everywhere, and anything and everything now is moving towards supporting that, right? So as long as what's been built uses MCP or can be modified slightly quickly to support MCP as a communication layer, then we can connect through MCP and you can just plug and play and use like Lego blocks, plug it into the infrastructure, right? So you may have, for example, you may have your sales data in Databricks, and there may be a Databricks Genie agents that are set up there. And so great, you can connect to the Databricks MCP server and then Concierge just has to route the question to that MCP server, get the response and render it. Maybe some other things in customer support are in your Fabric ecosystem. Great, then you can just connect to the Fabric data agent and route questions there. When it's appropriate. And then if somebody in finance decided to go already selected and deployed Wisdom AI for their solution, we can connect to that as an example, right? So the specific examples here are not as important as thinking about it more from an architectural perspective. You want to have flexibility, right? Because your technology stack is moving quickly. People are deploying different things. So the main idea is you want to leverage MCP with a routing infrastructure with this domain-based approach so that users can either specify a domain and say what they want, or they can maybe route intelligently to that based on the nature of what gets asked. And that's how we look at it, right? So that's kind of the domain-driven approach. Now, what did we when I say integrate into your corporate AI strategy? Well, what do I mean there? Well, here, imagine for a moment that you have an AI gateway, right? Most organizations either have one of these things that they're building themselves, or they're going to vendors like Glean or Gemini Enterprise or any number of tools to be able to build something where there's a place where people can come in and they can ask questions, and then it will access all of the resources in your enterprise, right? So typically that starts with your corporate document store because that's the easiest thing to access. So people in finance can ask questions about financial documents, people in customer support can ask questions about all the FAQs that they have, and so on and so forth, right? And that gets indexed, and there's an LLM that searches across that and delivers responses to you. So that's maybe your AI gateway. You're deploying it. That's great, but it needs to be tied into your BI strategy, right? So again, here the MCP infrastructure can act as a way to kind of glue everything together in a way that is very flexible. So you don't want your AI gateway talking directly to the MCP servers behind every single BI tool, for example, or connecting to the BI tools themselves, because you want to have the questions handled through a governed way. And it's the BI team is probably handling the governance of all the analytics. They've determined what dashboards are good, which ones are not, which semantic models that are related to Snowflake or a Vertex agent or something like that are relevant, right? So what you do is you create, instead you put, like, whether it's in Metric Insights or some other application, you create this AI for BI application that handles all the governance access to everything BI related. That can be managed by the BI team or multiple teams. That BI team can be the COE for that, and then people in the business can plug additional things in and certify and identify items. And then in this case, like using the Metric Insights MCP server connected to your AI gateway, now the AI gateway can route requests that go to the Metric Insights server and get, or to your whatever tool you're using for your AI for BI, and that system can now respond with the appropriate response. And it could be routing, again, in this example, it will be routing things further down the line to other MCP servers. So what you're seeing here is the classic, if you're a developer, the whole idea of separation of concerns, where each particular module knows about what it needs to know about, and it calls other things that then within that know what they need to know about, kind of that classic sort of old Russian doll approach to development that's tried and true to abstraction. That can be applied directly here in developing your AI architecture. It can be flexible, it can be modular, and you can add and subtract as you need to with things being added. So you want to be thinking right out of the gate architecture that looks like this, right? Again, tools are less important, the specifics are less important, but using something that has these characteristics sets up the framework for success and for proper governance. And then, of course, right, in your AI gateway, you're going to be adding things potentially non-BI related. So you might have other MCP servers that can connect your Salesforce system or your support system or whatever it is. And so now you can just plug these things in, and everything has its own separation of concerns, and everything can talk to other agents that will work in your ecosystem and solve for problems. So this is we believe the sort of best practice template to use for how you would implement. Okay, so let's talk about building trust for a moment, right? To have good governance, you have to have trust. So what does that mean? Well, there are a few pieces. First of all, domain access and routing has to be managed and security needs to be applied. So that means not just that your domain has security within it. That's obviously critical, but that when you're talking about, when somebody asks a question, the system, the primary system that's working with that needs to know whether it can route to that subsystem or not. So for example, in our case, Metric Insights, it needs to know when you ask a question, if you're in the finance group, okay, I've got these finance domains available to you, but the manufacturing domain is not available to you. So don't route it to that, never route to that, and never show it even as an option. So I don't pick that and then get frustrated because I don't have access to anything. So kind of having smart, user-friendly, but also secure access and routing is very important. And similarly, if I ask a question, if maybe I have access to both the manufacturing and the finance question, and I ask a question about finance, the system you're working with better be smart enough to be able to figure out that it needs to route it to the finance MCP server, and not the manufacturing one. Row level access security and having engineered that from the beginning and thinking about that from the beginning, clearly important, right? Most data in enterprise, when you get the things that are useful, becomes a sense, has row level security that needs to be enforced. So identity management such that that can be enforced and making sure that's built into your architecture from the beginning, critical. Because otherwise, if you don't have that, you don't have governance, you're not going to be able to roll out anything beyond kind of a POC. Question ambiguity and handling that intelligently is also very important. We can always demo examples where our questions are very clear, but sometimes it's not clear. I may ask a question about, for example, I'm looking for some financial report, some financial data. Well, do I want to report that has that financial data, or am I looking for the answer, right? Maybe sometimes it's not obvious. So being able to handle ambiguity in a way where you can present the user with the fact that, hey, I can answer this in these different ways, what you want, what you actually want, rather than making decisions poorly on their behalf is critical, because that's what people expect from AI-based systems. And then having kind of smart starter questions, right? We're used to these in other systems, but think about this. You may know you've set up all your domains and you know what each of them has in it, but your users may not. So when they coming in to be able to explore it, to be able to even have a good, smart set of starter questions that tell me what's the scope that's in here, what are the kinds of things I can ask, goes a really long way to creating good user experience, building trust with users that, okay, I can ask this kind of question because I've seen something similar in the starter questions that are there. So then let's imagine you've done that, you've good architecture, you've thought through everything to build trust. Then it's really about, it's kind of a promoting ROI and really measuring that ROI, right? So there are a few critical steps associated with that you want to think about. First of all, from the beginning, for any systems you're including, you got to make sure you're tracking what are the questions being asked by whom, and be able to report on those things, right? Because if you don't know that, if you're not in some log file that nobody can decipher, but have that someplace where you can clearly report out to management on that. This is sort of the starting gate, right? I need to know, well, are people asking questions? How many people, who's asking, what are they asking, and are we serving responses that are helpful to them, right? So that being able to, that necessary for improving that tool, and also necessary to know whether it's being used at all, right? But that just gives you one data point. It gives you kind of a usage, right? And usage is not necessarily the same as ROI, because maybe your users are going and asking questions, getting responses, but they're not finding those responses particularly helpful. So surveying users for the solution in some kind of rigorous way and asking the question, okay, we've rolled out this particular bot, these many questions have been asked, here's who asked them. Go back to that community and say, okay, you use the system. How was it valuable? Did it save you time? How much time did it save you? Did it help you make better decisions? What were the specific benefits that were done? Compiling that information. That then gives you the signal that tells you whether you want to keep that, continue investing in it, or whether it was a nice idea, kind of, you learned some things, but that should be retired. And then retiring things that are not useful. So avoiding the clutter problem that is frankly plagued most organizations with business intelligence, right? If you look in most, environments, let's say they have Power BI, people are self-serving, so everyone kind of creates self-service. It's great, but like there's so much clutter, right? Because there's so much stuff that's been created, and then somebody moved on and they left the company, or they created something else, and nobody ever bothers to go to remove what's there. You want to absolutely avoid this when it comes to your AI solutions, because it's going to overwhelm you for your users, and it creates poor governance. So doing the review and then purging things that are not used, so that when somebody comes into one of these spaces and it's using domains or an agent or whatever, they know that they're just using the good stuff. It's very important. Okay, so that was a lot. Let's kind of shift gears here for a moment and kind of look at a little bit of some of these things with specific examples, right? I've given you the high level theory and kind of the next level down. Mike is going to show you kind of what this looks like in action. Mike, are you there? You're still on mute if you're saying anything.
Just sharing my screen there.
Okay, great.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Marius. Yeah, let me take you through the Metric Insights platform and kind of highlight some of those things that Marius was talking about to sort of make them a bit more real and practical. And yeah, we'll touch on some of those areas. So uh, we spoke about this in the slides a minute ago, but sort of and we've spoken about it many times in previous sessions in this series. But the heart of what we're doing in Metric Insights is providing sort of this governed space for access to analytics and data to organizations. So that manifests itself in this idea of a portal, which at its foundation is a catalog of governed content that you want to make available to users, which is what you're looking at here. Each of these tiles is a particular report or asset that we've published into the Metric Insights catalog, regardless of tool that it might have been coming from. So Power BI, Tableau, Sigma, whatever it might be. And in publishing it, you're able to enrich it with any metadata that might be interesting to the users. So, glossary terms, ownership, does it contain sensitive information? Is the data classified? What's the lineage of that content? Has it been certified? At what level has it been certified? So that a user has the full context around, okay, I know what this is. I know what it contains in terms of metrics and definitions, and I know I can trust it. And if I go into that, I have one place to access content through the catalog. So in this case, it's doing a single sign-on into Power BI in this case, and I now have access to that dashboard. And so whether I'm looking at Power BI or whether I'm drilling into Tableau or whatever the tool might be, it's a consistent experience. Now, what we've been talking about is kind of bringing that experience to these Ask Your Data, these data agent type solutions. And as Marius said, in our platform, we do that through the concept of what we call our concierge. And think of it almost as sort of the catalog or the portal, if you like, for the data agents, for the AI solutions that you're building in your analytics and BI space. It's a way of sort of bringing all that together. Um, Now, if you think back to the initial architecture diagram that Marius showed, we have some native capabilities within Concierge as it relates primarily to the catalog and the BI content that I was just showing you. So users can come in and ask questions to essentially search and find content within the catalog in conversational ways. So simple examples like, which report should I look at if I want to analyze our sales numbers? If I ask that sort of question, Concierge understands that, obviously I'm searching for reports. It pulls out key terms. It looks through that metadata that we were just talking about and brings me back sort of recommended lists of reports based on that. I can obviously click on these. I can ask follow-up questions, which of these are certified to narrow down my list, similar to if I was picking up the phone to an analyst and asking them to help find me something. It's probably a bit of a back and forth conversation. So using concierge in a discovery type way is sort of native to the tool. I can also use it to answer sort of help and FAQ type questions as well. Or, whether it's native help of the Metric Insights platform or whether you're uploading sort of more business type FAQs, you can do that. So how do I subscribe to that sales report? If I want to receive it in email, it recognizes I'm asking for help around that, and it can go out either to the FAQs or the help docs and bring me back some direction around how to do that. Now, with Concierge, we then have the ability to start tying it into native, as Marius said, ask your data type solutions, which can and often will be spread across various different platforms and technologies, depending on, again, this concept of the domain. What is it you're trying to solve with that solution, and therefore what is the right technology to use for that. So, in our environment here, we have Fabric, Microsoft, where we've built data agents, which work at the semantic model within Microsoft, where again you can create agents. Here's one around customer support. You can publish those agents. You can give users access to them, and they can come in and obviously through this interface start to have conversations with the domain, the data that you've chosen for that particular domain and that particular semantic model in this case, which is what you're seeing down the left-hand side here. So you may have certain solutions built in Fabric. You may have Databricks in your environment where you're building, Genie applications that again are tied to certain types of data that are being stored in that solution. So again, this is, looking at supply chain, I think, and finance data here. So yeah, that's an option. And then again, you may have these, native AI solutions where, they're standalone. They're pointed at certain areas of your data infrastructure. This is Wisdom AI, and again, it's tied to answering questions around that particular type of data. So it's not unusual. I'm not saying you've got all of these, but it's not unusual to have different solutions across the organization to answer these questions. And for the user, in this scenario, I would have to know where to go and what the scope of that particular solution is to be able to get accurate responses. So what we do in Metric Insights is tie that into the concept of domains. So a domain within our solution is a particular sort of, think of it as a subject area. Obviously has a description and a purpose associated with it. And it's tied to a particular solution on the back end through the concept of the MCP server that Marius was talking about. So we've set up Fabric data agents to answer questions around customer support. Therefore, we want to tie that to our customer support domain. Sales may be coming from another tool, finance may be coming from Databricks. So at the domain level, we're basically specifying the domain. We're saying what sorts of questions can that domain answer, and then tying it to the relevant solution on the back end through the MCP server. We're also setting so in doing that, we're basically saying, okay, we're explicitly tying in that particular solution because it's something that we know has been tested and QA'd, and that we know we're confident in the same way we publish reports through the portal and the catalog. We can now publish this particular, in this case, Fabric data agent into the catalog as something that users have access to. And we can control domain access at the user group level, so maybe not provide it to everyone, but give certain groups of users or individual users access to that domain. Therefore, knowing that only the people who should be asking questions of that data are. So what does that do to the concierge layer then from a UI perspective? Is what it means now is when I come into concierge, not only can I search through tiles and FAQs and glossary terms, all the things that are sort of native to the platform, but based on my permissions and access, I have access to ask questions of other domains that I have permissions to do so. And so I can go in and explicitly select domains and ask particular questions associated with that domain. But what Concierge also does is handle the routing of questions using the information that we have around what domains are basically optimized to answer questions around. So what that manifests itself in is, so if I ask something like, what is our purchase order volume by product category, Concierge is going to look at that question and say, okay, what domains do we have that can potentially answer or give information around this? And it may be one or more that it comes. In this case, it said, okay, I've actually found a report that is focused around purchase order volume. So you may want to take a look at that. But we also have, in this case, a domain associated with Wisdom AI, where we've published a chatbot to answer data level questions around that. It's gone out and sent the question to Wisdom through the MCP server. It's responded with data, and in this case, a chart to give me an actual answer to that question. I was asking. So that routing and the effectiveness of that routing is really what's key to driving sort of a seamless end user experience. And if you think about it from a sort of business use perspective, that routing may get fairly involved. So here's an example where it's very data focused here. We're answering questions around the data. So how does our support volume compared to the average? So in this case, it's recognized that I'm asking obviously questions around customer support. It's routed it to that particular domain, which is linked to Microsoft Fabric. Fabric has come back, and we mentioned this in the slides as well, making sure that you're solving ambiguity in any questions. So in this case, Fabric has come back and said, there's ambiguity in that question. I'm not really sure what you want to compare or what you want to compare it to. So it's asked for some clarification. So I've come back and said, actually, I want to compare August to the previous 6 months. So it's taken that context. It's again figured out that there's actually a report around this that might help, but it also knows in this case that it can answer it from a data perspective, and it's come back with what was August's support ticket volume compared to the 6 month average, showing a fairly significant increase in that volume. I can continue the conversation. Why was that? It's obviously assuming that I'm still asking about this, which was answered by Fabric. So it continues the conversation with Fabric. It's come back with a response saying, high number of returns during that month, product returns in our retail example here. That might be something that you want to drill into. And again, can continue the conversation. Well, do any suppliers have product issues during August? And it's taken that question. It said, okay, this is less about sort of customer support now. Do we have any domains related to supply chain? We do. It's that one that was pointed to wisdom. And therefore, let's take that follow-on question with all the context and pass it over to, in this case, the wisdom tool and see what that answers. And it can some context around suppliers having defects rates and low quality in that particular month. So you can see very quickly that if I wanted to go through this flow in without having something like this front end like concierge, again, I would have to know where to go and ask my questions to get this sort of information. One other benefit that you can sort of put in place if you are using a sort of front end like this is that certain tools and technologies that you're creating these agents in, these solutions in, have differing capabilities. So they obviously can all answer textual based responses. Some do have charting capabilities, some don't. Well, if you implement a sort of front end to this, you can start to standardize on what sort of capabilities are available. Like charting, you may want to take care of at the level that you're creating the sort of overarching chatbot at, in this case concierge, so that if it is routing something that doesn't necessarily have charting as a capability, even though that's the case, when you get the responses back, you can implement the charting to then render information appropriately and consistently across the different tools and technologies. And that's what's happening in this case. We've routed it to a tool that only has textual response, but it can send me the numbers back and we'll implement the charting at the front end. Final thing from a domain perspective is the concept of sort of Marius referred to them as smart questions in his presentation. Really being able to sort of guide people with the sort of questions they can ask around these different domains. And not only that, so if I'm asking a question, you can upload different sort of template questions related to each domain, which is what you're looking at here. But if you have those and people are navigating around the rest of the portal and catalog that we looked at initially, so maybe I've come into this global summary report in Power BI, it's based around sales information. Well, do things like pre-select the domain when they pop open the concierge panel. recommend some questions around sales. So sort of guide them in terms of the analysis that they're looking at in that at that point in time. So if I'm looking at the sales report, presuppose that I'm going to be asking questions about sales. If I'm looking at customer service, presuppose I'm going to be asking questions around customer service. And obviously, as a user, I can go in and change these, and depending on what I ask, it may change that domain to route it appropriately, but it gives me some guidance around the scope of what's in the data that I'm analyzing at that point in time. Um, Final thing I want to touch on, and then we'll open it up to questions. So again, any questions, pop them in the chat window. There's a few coming in here, so we'll leave 5 minutes at the end here. Just some measurement and an analysis of the effectiveness of what you're doing as you roll out these solutions is critical to sort of understanding, what should be out there and what you should keep using, but again, tying it to ROI and the things business case that Marius mentioned. So, simple thing like if you're implementing something like Concierge, ensuring that it can track at a macro level across the different tools and technologies, what's going on. So whether that's just things like user engagement, for each of these lines represents a particular domain and tool that we're working with. How is the engagement with users over time? Good, or is there one tool that's had a spike when we launched it but has dropped off since, therefore users are not finding it as useful as we'd hoped, and we need to revisit it. Questions asked, how many questions are getting asked over time in each tool, and being able to drill down to a level of that where there's details around it. So to Marius's point, who are your engaged users? What domains are they working within? What are the top questions in each domain that are getting asked that we maybe want to further refine so that we can help users? Having that tracking of all that information at a detailed level, at a macro level across the different tools and technologies is critical to sort of understanding what's happening there. And then tying that to more subjective type information, so having a way to collect, in this case through the portal, survey information around customer subjective, user subjective feedback. The questions you put on here are going to be related to sort of what you're rolling out, but what are they finding useful? How often are they using these things? How accurate are they finding them? What's the rate of ease of how they're finding these tools to work with? Does it save them time over sort of just looking at reports and technologies? What features do they like? The sort of things that are more sort of touchy-feely and subjective, but give you an idea of how users are perceiving what's going on out there and what you're putting out there, and tying that to the usage stats that we were just looking at gives you some perspective on that. So we've come up to 5 minutes to go. So there's a couple of questions here. Hopefully that's given you a sort of general idea of the sort of things that you should be thinking about as you architect these solutions. Let's go and look at some questions. I'm just bringing some up here, Marius, if you want to come off mute.
Sure, I'm here.
Okay, so there's a question about handling sign-on and security to the different tools and technologies if you have a layer like Concierge in place. Maybe you can talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, so in general, that's a good question, and obviously, we talked about the fact that security and row-level security is important. So that requires identity, and identity has to be passed through the different layers of the architecture. There are kind of two approaches that you can take here, and both will work with that whole MCP infrastructure. One of them is to have more of the idea of a service account plus identity passing sort of model. So imagine like having a bearer token that authenticates to the MCP server, to that next layer, the MCP server, and then you pass, within that you pass the identity of who it is that's actually logging in. So there's kind of that sort of approach, and then there's also the OAuth approach, right, where which I think is becoming even more prevalent. Like for example, Databricks and Snowflake both support this in their authentication and works with their MCP servers. Is that you essentially when the user logs in for the very first time and uses that MCP, they have to authenticate to that service. They do have to do it once. Then there's an OAuth token that gets generated, and then the client or the calling application, like in our example is Concierge, but it's whatever you're using to connect to that service. Has to then retains that token, also has a refresh token, and then goes and gets that session token on a regular basis. So that way you all ask that login once, but never again, right? Next time you come in 2 or 3 or 5 days later, you're still continue the conversation in a secure way because the application can use the refresh token to go get a new session token. And so those are the two models to pass identity in a way that's secure and ensures that kind of row level security can work all the way up and down the tree.
Yeah, I guess this is a fair question. So we talked about ROI and measuring ROI, but I guess we didn't explicitly say how. We talked
Mhm.
about usage and stuff. Maybe drill into that area a little bit.
Yeah. So I think, this is one of those things where the most important thing is to begin with the end in mind. As that old Stephen Covey expression goes, right? You want to have a really good idea when you're deploying a particular service, right? An agent or something that you're going to connect into your infrastructure. Part of the governance layer for there should be to say, okay, well, what are the benefits that we're expecting? Like how are we going to measure ROI? Because if you don't know how you're going to measure ROI when you're deploying the thing, you're not going to be able to measure it because you're not going to know what questions to ask. So, obviously there's classical areas. Are you looking to generate time savings with a particular community? Is this going to help people? If it's helping them find documents and you're looking to be able to generate ROI by saving a certain number of hours a week or a month that they would otherwise spend looking for things. Okay, that's one source. If you're looking for being able to improve the quality of decision making and therefore improving like costs, reducing costs in some area, you want to have an idea of that. If it's a revenue promotion thing, hey, we're going to be able to be more effective. Obviously, some of these like revenue costs and things like that are harder to tie to because if you say, hey, we're going to improve the effectiveness of our sales team, well, there may be other things you're doing simultaneously. But that said, if you have that North Star, if you know what you're going for, then when you go and do those surveys that Mike showed you, you can ask specifically that. You can say, okay, how much more, how much time did you save? What are there any deals that you closed last quarter that you were able to close that would not have closed? Where did you had you not had that tool? Things of that nature. And then when you're coming back with ROI numbers based on that survey, you're tying it to real things that people have reported. It's not just sort of made up numbers based on assumptions. And I think that's the key. So know what the expectation is, not to a specific number, but directionally what you're trying to affect. What's the KPI or the metric that you want to move, and then go out and either measure it in an absolute way, but also more importantly, ask your users.
So there's a couple more questions, but we're at the top of the hour here, so we'll follow up in email afterwards with those. We'll be conscious of people's time. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Marius. I hope this was useful to everyone. Again, the recording will be up on our YouTube channel, Metric Insights, but we'll follow up with an email with the link as well. And hope you can join us at the next one. I think it's going to be on December the 3rd. I think it's actually the last one in this series, but we'll certainly be coming back with more in the future. And we're going to be focusing on sort of tying all this together from a sort of governance and AI and cataloging experience into how you can really drive better user experience and adoption across BI using all the technologies. So hope you can join us for that. But thanks for joining today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mike.